Welcome to another scholarship highlight, brought to you by the Center for Firearms Law at Duke University School of Law. This series is a part of the Center's broader effort to deepen the scholarly discussion of firearms law by engaging directly with some of the many scholars who are producing original and insightful work. I'm Jake Charles, Executive Director of the Center, and this week we're joined by Dru Stevenson, Professor of Law at South Texas College of Law, Houston. We're going to be talking to him about his new paper, Gun Violence as an Obstacle to Educational Equality, forthcoming in the University of Memphis Law Review. Thanks for being here, Dru.
Thanks for having me.
So first off, just can you give us a nutshell take on what is the argument in your paper?
So the argument is that we have a problem, a well-known problem with educational inequality in our country, and a component of that, or a factor of that, is the pervasive gun violence, especially in our inner cities. And it's a lot of times our gun debate doesn't recognize that there are sort of secondary and tertiary effects, and that are affecting the actual school performance of students who live in an environment where they're surrounded by kind of uncontrolled gun violence every day.
What got you interested in the subject, or motivated you to write about this?
Well, to be honest, partly there was a call for papers for a symposium about educational inequality, and part of my personal research agenda is approaching firearms policy from more of a regulatory standpoint than necessarily a constitutional or rights standpoint. And as part of that, I think it's important to highlight the way that firearms law, firearms policy overlaps with other areas of law and other areas of social policy that our legal system is wrestling with. And so there's a lot of people that focus on writing about schools and the long-standing and actually growing disparity in school performance and school achievement and so forth between our suburbs and our inner cities and the poor and rich communities. And I wanted to introduce into that there's an issue here that we can't talk about school equality and educational equality if we're not going to talk about guns. And there's a lot of areas of law like that, that guns should not be like a cottage industry off here where we're talking about guns as a separate issue that doesn't affect everything else.
Yeah, I mean, I think I like the approach that you have, which is coming to the issue of guns from a sometimes unexplored angle, which is the regulatory administrative aspect of firearms, instead of a rights versus rights or a rights versus government interest type of frame where the rhetoric tends to get more heated and the claims tend to be more exaggerated. We've all seen this many times, but to maybe take some of the heat out of the argument and say, well, let's look at another framework for analyzing these types of questions, maybe one that we can agree on more solutions, where there's not going to be as many as there may not be as many kind of things to get people who want to own guns and want free access to guns riled up as there might be with, a law that, say, imposes more requirements on gun owners. So with this paper, what scholarly discussions are you hoping to join or maybe to create as a result of this scholarship and this kind of line of inquiry?
Well, this was the article itself was originally supposed to be part of a symposium on educational inequality that, of course, succumbed to most symposium and conferences succumbed to the pandemic. But I wanted to interject a discussion about how gun violence affects things into the discussion amongst education scholars. And so there's a group of scholars that focus on educational rights and legal policy for fostering educational equality and achievement with our students and things like that for the betterment of society. And I want those people to realize that guns are part of what they're talking about. And on the side, I'm always hoping to get the people that are interested in guns and writing about guns to think about more and more about the spillover effects into other areas of law, that this is not an isolated legal issue. And so the primary audience was education law scholars,
Mm-hmm.
and the secondary audience is firearms law scholars.
Yeah, I mean, it really neatly ties together these two fields and says, look, you both have something to contribute to this space, and don't ignore the implications for your rights frame. Don't ignore the implications for your education frame of, how gun violence affects educational outcomes. And I guess kind of related to that, you start off with this really interesting anecdote about a case currently ongoing in Chicago, the Powell case. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that case, kind of about what the claims are and how that relates to the thesis of your article.
Okay, so the case is a class action lawsuit that's brought primarily as a disability rights case, as opposed to liability for gun manufacturers or something like, the traditional litigation in the kind of the gun law space. And the argument or theory of the case is that there are students, certain boroughs or neighborhoods of Chicago, where the gun violence, the level of gun violence that children experience all around them, like hearing gunfire outside on the street every night as they're falling asleep. Every school year, some of their classmates are killed by gun violence every year. And they've a huge percentage of them have lost immediate family members to gun violence. And this is, and so the argument is that this gun violence traumatizes the children and leaves them with post-traumatic stress disorder, and which directly ends up causing learning disabilities and performance problems in school. And so the legal angle, like the defendants in the case, right, are the state of Illinois, and the argument is that they need to do more to enforce the gun laws that they have, and which is, I know, part of the long-standing rhetoric in the gun rights space, like, why don't we enforce the laws we have? And what they're saying is the fact that we're not enforcing the laws that we have is actually making children in certain neighborhoods suffer disabilities. And so it's very interesting because it's a disability case, it's a class action case, and it's not the traditional defendant of a gun manufacturer or dealer, although the real villains in the case are particularly gun dealers who the state is not enforcing the laws, making sure that the gun dealers are doing what they're supposed to.
And you mentioned it seems like a rather unique case, and I'll say I haven't heard of any other cases like this either. Do you have any guesses on why this case is coming about now? Why this is kind of the first time that we're seeing this kind of theory?
So yes, I think there's two things. First, in 2015, the same firm that brought this case had previous successes 5 years ago, suing some of the other suburbs of Chicago, where there were a couple of really notorious gun dealers, like just bad apple gun dealers that were scofflaws, so to speak. And what they did was they got a settlement out of these suburbs that they were going to do more with their local powers to crack down on this derelict gun dealer or a handful of bad apple gun dealers. And so kind of buoyed by that success, I think they then, the bigger picture is Chicago itself. And then the other reason I think that this came about now is that really in the last, let's say 3 or 4 years, from 2016 to 2018, when the case was first filed, there's been some really outstanding research about the educational impacts on children of living in communities with high gun violence. And this is something I think a lot of people might have assumed, but it's really, there's a handful of sociologists and psychologists and theorists who've really doubled down on this and looked at it closely and done some fantastic empirical research. And so the lawyers bringing the case now have some pretty strong, convincing empirical research about the connection. It's not just an assumption.
Yeah, and as an administrative scholar, you note some of the interesting facets of this case, and there may be some questions of redressability and what kind of orders a court can do with respect to state officials enforcing or enacting regulations or law. But this is surely a case to watch, and I take it we've had no new development since the motion to dismiss was decided.
That's to my knowledge. I have reached out to the attorney who's now handling the case, and for an update. A lot of these sort of like slow-moving litigation cases are in suspended animation, as you know, because of the courts being closed. So I'm not sure that there's been developments. I have talked to the attorney in the case, and in terms of judicial redress, what they're really hoping is that the state will settle and just agree to do what they're legally required by statute to do, and that's something I like about this is not something where the plaintiffs are trying to get money. They're really seeking injunctive relief, and so a settlement where the state agrees to do that that's all they want, is for the gun violence to go down.
So let me shift to a little bit of a different theme then. So
Sure.
one of kind of your main themes, at least in part of the article, is that there's a ton of media attention around a very rare event, but one that is certainly tragic and certainly gut-wrenching, and that's the school mass shootings.
Right.
Note that for the most part, these tend to happen, at least the high number of fatality mass shootings tend to happen in more suburban regions, and maybe that's part of the reason that they get such outsized media attention, that when we see certain types of students being victimized by gun violence, we think something different in the media narrative than we think when we see hear constant daily stories of students of color in inner city schools in their communities facing constant gun violence. And some of the stories in the lawsuit in the article about the constancy of the gun violence that these really young students are experiencing is really, really heart-wrenching. But you talk about how the responses to these school mass shootings that happen tends to be things like more police and enforcement efforts. So, metal detectors at schools, or more armed guards on campus. And you talk about that this can actually end up really hurting these communities who are actually experiencing a lot of the daily gun violence in numerous ways that affects their educational outcomes. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, maybe some of the evidence that you talk about in the paper.
Sure. So you've summarized it nicely, and just to kind of recap, the idea is that there's the media coverage is skewed towards these horrific mass shooting, active shooter events, and they primarily occur in white suburbs and middle-class suburbs, and then there's very little media attention of the far, just in terms of fatalities and common frequency of inner city of school violence. And so this is around the schools and in the neighborhoods of the schools after school hours, but also sometimes there's single shootings that happen during the school day or in the schoolyard, or as students are showing up for school. And it triggers, so the public, and then the media attention, it creates in the public imagination, it triggers a legislative response, like you said, that is essentially to militarize the schools more and make the schools feel more on lockdown. And there's a lot of empirical literature now that we now have sort of a school to prison pipeline that's been created, where these measures that people thought, oh, we need metal detectors, we need armed guards in the school, we need zero tolerance policies if somebody has a pocket knife or something like that. And what happens is that we have students who already feel, students of color, have a very different relationship with seeing armed police walking around up and down their halls with walkie-talkies, and are looking at them with suspicion. And so the fear, and as I put it in the article, is if you live in a nice suburb outside of a city, the students may think of all of these things, it makes them feel safe. They think the guard is there to keep me safe. And for some of these students, they feel like this guard is there to arrest me, right? To watching for me to step out of line, to have a bulge in my pocket. There could be a knife or something like that. And then they get expelled permanently from school over infractions, and it fast tracks them to sort of the life of crime and a life on the street. And this has been talked about for many years because we started these zero tolerance policies in the schools back in the Clinton years, really. And and then it has this disproportionate bad effect on children of color, unfortunately.
Yeah. And so you talk a little bit more throughout the paper, a lot more really, about these issues and about a couple of ways to maybe redress some of the educational obstacles that are caused by gun violence. And I kind of want to talk about some of your proposed solutions. And I guess I would split them up, and you can tell me if you think this is a fair summation or not, but into the kind of non-coercive solutions. So these, community-based violence prevention efforts that are wholly voluntary, that are community-driven and community-based, and then maybe a set of coercive solutions. And these, would come in the form of new criminal laws, like raising the age to purchase a firearm, or safe storage laws, for instance. And I guess just with respect to the set of, and feel free to talk about both those solutions too, but with respect to the coercive solutions, new laws that are enforced by law enforcement many times, or sometimes at least on campus or in these communities, why not think those might lead to the same type of discriminatory enforcement against communities of color that that the other kind of effects of school mass shootings you've talked about did?
So I think that's a good point. And I mean, personally, I'll be the first to admit, I think we have a problem with over incarceration in our society. I listen to the prison abolition advocates. And so as much as I want more gun regulation, I don't want necessarily longer prison sentences for things or more people. And you're absolutely right. And that is a hesitation I have with some of these, the coercive proposals that I suggested. And if we had the in-person symposium, that's the part of the article I expected to get the most pushback on from the scholars in the education law space, because they're very attuned to the discriminatory impact of these types of laws. And so I do recognize that. By the way, that's part of why, and I say this in the article, I really like the remedies that the lawsuit is asking for, which is focused not on the person who ends up with the gun, but on the supply source of the gun, the point where they're entering the street and becoming crime guns, and that's the dealers. And the things that they want from the dealers are really pretty reasonable, and are things that the law already requires. And so simply reducing the supply of crime guns in these high crime communities, I think would make a difference. And then we have the whole question of like deterrence versus enforcement and the selective enforcement with these measures. So yeah, it's a valid point. It's a valid point, and it's a concern.
So a lot of the solutions that you propose are locally based solutions or approaches. Do you think there's any role for the federal government to play in kind of how gun violence affects the educational experience? Maybe any role for the U.S. Department of Education, for instance, or do you think this is really something that should be driven mostly by localities?
Well, I like localism personally, and I think that localism that's what's really part of the gridlock in our gun policy politics in this country, is that certain communities, the high crime communities don't want to have guns. They want to get rid of the guns, and a lot of times it's the communities with lower crime rates that are where they want the right to own guns. And so I think it would solve a lot of things if local communities had more autonomy. That being said, I do think that on the side of the federal government having more of a role in this, I certainly, these community violence prevention programs that have been shown to be very, very effective, these violence intervention, interrupters and things like that, but they take money, right? You need some people that get trained in this, and it's kind of their full-time job to do mediation between like rival gang factions and things like that. And the federal government right now, a lot of those programs, to be honest, during the pandemic are getting their funding cut because all the states are in a financial crisis, and the municipalities are. And so the federal government could certainly help with that. The other pro for the federal government getting involved is the state preemption laws that make it increasingly difficult for local locales, local municipalities that have a special problem that doesn't affect the rest of the state to tailor a solution to their own needs. And I actually think the federal government is ultimately going to have to intervene and preempt the states from preempting the cities in some way. That to me, that's the only solution long-term to our preemption problems.
Interesting, very interesting. Well, I can't let you get out of here without talking about the Second Amendment. So ask one final question, recognizing, of course, that it's not the focus of your paper, even tangentially. But one of your proposed solutions is, what about a possible age limitation on firearm possession? And you cite, a lot of statistics about youth development in general and gun use in particular among youth. And you say, maybe we should have 25 as a minimum age for gun possession. And again, recognizing this is not the focus of the paper, just want to ask you to opine a little bit on how you think that fare under kind of current constitutional doctrine.
So first of all, I'm not, constitutional law is, I'm going to defer to the people who really have expertise in the area of constitutional law. I'm more of an administrative law bureaucracy type of guy. And so I think of, when you talk about rights, I'm thinking of transaction costs and things like that and externalities. So I will defer to them. Personally, I think that some of our liberal judges who liked the world the way it was before Heller would uphold, would see no constitutional defect with a 25-year age limit, especially for handguns. We already have age limits for guns, and I think some of the conservative judges that are pro-gun would clearly think that the age limits we have are bad enough, and we can't. There's certainly arguments against raising the age. We have had age limits for a long time, and the question is there leeway in those age limits? Part of why, and by the way, as you and I have talked about, I think there's a lot of unpredictability about which direction the courts are going to go in the next 2 years. Not only the Supreme Court, but the local courts there's a lot of things with this pandemic that can affect the political landscape in the coming years that could then affect the way judges feel about Second Amendment issues. So also, I just want to throw out there, when other people want to talk about the Second Amendment, I think it's at least worthwhile to do a thought experiment where sometimes we talk about, what if we didn't have a Second Amendment? What would be the perfect law that we could have? And then maybe we could talk about a way of thinking about rights that if we restrict rights on this area, maybe actually we could give you more rights in another way. So for example, if we raise the age limit on guns, if we found a way to have certain restrictions that really reduced gun violence in this country, then maybe we wouldn't need other restrictions and so there would be a sort of a net freedom effect, if that makes sense, in terms of Second Amendment infringement. And so, and we don't usually talk like that. That maybe if we had certain infringements, we could lighten up other types of infringements and think of it in terms of rights and in terms of the net effect in the aggregate.
Well, this has been a really edifying, interesting, and really fun discussion. So thanks for joining us, Dru, and
thanks for having me
at home for joining us. Please follow us on Twitter, go to our website, and follow along with the rest of this series. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Sanjay. Bye.